Welcome to Understanding Intercultural Transitions from Chapter 8 of Intercultural Communication in Contexts. So, we're talking about transitions between cultures. So, what we'll talk about is how to describe from a dialectical approach these cultural transitions, talk about different types of migrant groups, talk about cultural adaptation, and talk about how individual characteristics may affect adaptation, what culture shock is, what's the issue of re-entry when we leave and return to our original culture, and then how to approach, right, from each perspective, these issues of cultural transition. So, yeah, thinking dialectically about intercultural transitions. So, the privileged, disadvantaged dialectic structures some kinds of intercultural transitions, right? So, for example, business people who live abroad while working for transnational corporations often are economically privileged. They receive additional pay, housing relocation money, and so on. Often, in adapting to new cultural contexts, people may find themselves challenged to be culturally competent by behaving in ways that may be contradictory to their personal identities, right? So, what we're dealing with are what are these challenges of transitioning? There are times when we transition from one culture to another and we have privilege, and there are times when we face disadvantages. And so, here we think about first types of migrant groups. So migration may be long-term or short-term. Short-term, it may be voluntary or involuntary. A migrant is any individual who leaves the primary cultural context in which he or she was raised or has lived for an extended period and moves to a new cultural context for an extended period. So it's not the same as a tourist, right? It's somebody who actually moves somewhere to live somewhere to be part of a new culture to some extent. So culture transitions may vary in length and in degree of voluntariness, right? So depending on how long they're going to be there, and then whether they're being forced to be there, whether they're choosing to be there, or something in between, right? Um, so let's start with voluntary migrants. There are two groups of voluntary travelers: sojourners and immigrants. Sojourners are those travelers who move into new cultural contexts for a limited time and a specific purpose. So you might think about somebody like a tourist, right, who goes to visit somewhere. Or say you have family in a particular place and you just go to visit for a short amount of time. Another type of voluntary traveler is the immigrant, right? So there's often a fluid and interdependent relationship between the countries that send and receive immigrants. That is, some countries regularly receive immigrants from other countries. Think about the United States that regularly receives immigrants from Mexico and other Central and South American countries. Right? So we have kind of large groups of those immigrants in the United States. Um, and sometimes that is a migration pattern that goes back and forth. So we have um, work visas, for example, for agriculture, for migrant workers who will come and work different seasons around the United States, and then in the off season return to Mexico, right? So in this case, it's fluid, people going back and forth. So there are two kinds of migrant labor. There's cheap manual labor. So then when you talk about agriculture, that's what you're thinking about, these special visas, right, to allow people to come and work temporarily where you need cheap manual labor, and high skilled intellectual labor. Increasing numbers of immigrant workers are women. Because they're often more reliable than men, they are increasingly doing manual work and employed as domestics. And more people are moving temporarily. People go somewhere to work and live for shorter periods. So you might have a contract that takes you for a month to work in Germany, and then for another month to work in France, and then you're back home for a big chunk of time. These kind of moves are becoming more and more regular with transnational corporations and the ease of international travel. Overseas study options are increasing, and today many of Australia's skilled migrants are drawn from the overseas skilled student cohort, with similar trends in Canada, the United States, and Europe, right? So think about how many times students will come from different countries to the United States and end up staying either to continue their studies at the master's or doctoral level, or to take jobs in highly skilled areas, if they're engineers or scientists. or if they're specialists in whatever field they might be studying, right? A core principle of the 27 countries who belong to the European Union is this idea of freedom of movement, meaning that an EU national may travel to another EU member state and live, study, or work on an equal basis with native born residents. That means equal access to things like healthcare that are more universally covered across Europe. And so, what does this do? Well, this makes migration not only easier, but also more fluid, as people can move easily back and forth between countries in the European Union. This, of course, is very different from involuntary migrants, people who do not volunteer to be migrants. There are two types of migrants that move involuntarily, long term and short term, right? These are the ways we're kind of breaking them down. So, long term refugees include people who are forced to relocate permanently because of war, famine, and oppression. Think about people whose families were members of a political party or movement that then ultimately lost and became victims of a fascist regime. Well, those are involuntary migrants, or people who wanted to live in their countries, but because of oppression and the threat of violence, need to escape their home countries. So they're kind of forced to leave or die, or stay and die, right? Short-term refugees include people who are forced for a short time to move from the region or territory. We can think about in Louisiana, for example, Hurricane Katrina temporarily forced large numbers of New Orleanians to leave the city, um, many of whom chose to return and many of whom didn't, right? So in that case, we had both long-term and short-term, but the time they were forced to leave was fairly short-term, right? While things were rebuilt and cleaned up. There are cases of domestic refugees who are forced for short or indefinite periods to move within a country, right? Just like that. The mass migration of refugees presents complex issues for intercultural communication, pointing to the importance of the relationship between the migrants and their host cultures, right? So, mass migration, we might see, for example, people still fleeing Syria and these refugee camps all over um, Europe and Eastern Asia, where the host countries are struggling to deal with this mass migration of a large number of refugees at the same time. So, migrant host relationships. The relationship between immigrants and hosts are very complex, and understanding these relationships requires a dialectical approach. International migration is usually a carefully considered individual or family decision, and the major reason to migrate can involve economic and or non-economic reasons and complex push-pull factors, right? So you can see we're setting up all these dialects, right? Long term, short term, voluntary, involuntary, economic, non economic, push, pull. So an economic migrant may be encouraged to move by a host employer recruiter, pulling him or her to migrate, or a push factor might be the lack of jobs in home country. So that's when we see a pull factor, right? Somebody recruits you and says, "Hey, come work for my country, or come work for my company in this country." And you're like, "Yeah, I'll go." They're pulling you there, right? Push might be, well, where I live, there are no jobs for people of my skill set. So I'm being pushed to leave that area to find a job elsewhere. Migrants crossing borders for non economic reasons may be moving to escape persecution. That's a push factor, right? You're being pushed out of your area. One of the most important non economic motivations for crossing national borders is family unification, a pull factor for family migration, right? So, say part of your family has already moved somewhere else because of economic reasons, and now you're being pulled by family reunification, right? Um, Immigrants may be simultaneously accepted and rejected, privileged and disadvantaged. And relationships may be both static and dynamic, right? So, accepted and rejected by the host culture, privileged and disadvantaged depending on their relationship of power between them and their position in that host culture. And it can be static, right? It could be kind of a fixed situation where um, the conditions of the migrant in the host country are pretty stable or dynamic. Things can shift and change dramatically during the time of adaptation. So we'll talk about a couple of different modes of joining and adapting to a culture. So first is assimilation. And in assimilation mode, the individual does not want to maintain an isolated cultural identity, but wants to maintain relationships with other groups in the new culture, right? So this is where Assimilation is where you kind of forego your own identity, maybe not entirely, right? Or many parts of your own identity in order to accept the identity of the host culture and become part of that host culture. Typically, the migrant in this situation is more or less welcomed by the new cultural hosts. When this course is freely chosen by everyone, that is, by the migrant and by the hosts, it creates the archetypal melting pot, right? Where you can have a lot of people from lots of different areas who come together and kind of all assimilate together and become something new. This is the idea of 20th century, early 20th century migration into the United States, most of which, of course, came from European countries. So if all of these people from different European countries are all considered white American and assimilate to some kind of version of what is white American, foregoing their home languages and some of their home cultural practices, so they can all kind of get along, then you get your melting pot, right? However, when the dominant group forces assimilation, especially on immigrants whose cultures and customs are different from those of the host country, it creates a pressure cooker, right? So um, think about ideas now that we see in the news of people in the United States saying, you're an American, you need to speak English, even if America doesn't have formally an official language, right? And expecting immigrants from Central and South America to come in and assimilate, and they're not, right? And being asked or forced to assimilate. Um, and so it creates a pressure cooker. It can create a lot of tension between these two groups. And the result of this tension can be discrimination. So a heavy dose of discrimination can discourage retention of immigrants' original cultural practices, right? So sometimes to avoid discrimination, migrants, even those who don't choose to assimilate, are kind of forced to assimilate in order to participate more fully in the culture. A different way to think about adaptation, cultural adaptation, is the opposite of assimilation. Assimilation, where you kind of give up a lot of yourself to become part of the host culture. Separation is where you kind of give up the opportunity to really join the host culture and keep yourself separate, right? There are two forms of separation. The first is when migrants choose to retain their original culture and avoid interaction with other groups. You can think about this in areas, pockets in the cities where migrants from a particular area or culture live together and choose to do business together. Hasidic Jewish people in New York, for example, have very much this kind of maintenance of culture by separating themselves from the larger culture that's all around them. The example, of course, of the Amish as well, right? Came to the United States in the 18th century and have in many ways isolated themselves and their culture from uh, general American culture, and tremendous change during that time, right, of what it means to be American. If separation is initiated and enforced by the dominant society, the condition constitutes a second type of separation. That's segregation, right? So, in the first kind of separation, you're talking about people who are consciously and purposely separating themselves, right? They're choosing separation as a form of adaptation, a resistance to the dominant host culture. But sometimes, of course, um, segregation is imposed by the host culture. So, an example of what we call de facto segregation is the practice of redlining, in which banks refuse loans to members of particular ethnic groups to live in particular areas, right? In this way, um, people of different races and ethnicities are segregated into ghettos, into particular sections of the city where they are allowed to live, not legally, right? Because legally, we might already have legislation that says you can't discriminate on housing, but instead they're segregated economically, right? They only have the option to live in particular areas because it's the only way they can afford to live there. It's important to notice, of course, that segregation is not uniquely American. Under apartheid in South Africa, racial segregation was the established legal norm, and when it's legal, then we have, instead of de facto segregation, which is a series of um, cultural and social pressures that lead to segregation, but we can have de jure uh, segregation, which is by law, right? So in apartheid, it said uh, black South Africans had to live and work and have access only to these certain things, whereas white South Africans had access to so much more under apartheid. So legalized segregation. Integration. Integration is another form of adaptation. Integration occurs when migrants have an interest both in maintaining their original culture and language and in having daily interactions with other groups. Integration differs from assimilation in that it involves a greater interest in maintaining one's own cultural identity. Immigrants can resist assimilation in many ways, for example, by insisting on speaking their own language in their own home, or by naming their children names from their home cultures rather than from the host culture. Integration depends on the openness and willingness of those in the dominant society to accept and accommodate somewhat the cultures of others, right? So there are definitely places where it is easier to be representative of a home culture that is different from the host culture and still be accepted in places where that is much more difficult, right? But integration is more of a balanced position between assimilation um, and separation, right? Um, Cultural hybridity ultimately is what has to happen for most migrants. That is, migrants and their family often combine these different modes of relating to the host society, at times assimilating, other times integrating, and still other times separating, forming a cultural hybridity relationship with the host culture. And this, of course, goes along with the dialectical approach that we've been talking about, right? It's never just one thing or the other. It's one thing and the other, and all these things in between are two extremes, right? That the things are much more fluid and changing, right? Dynamic than maybe we like to think about. It's easier to study something that's static, right? And easier to study something that doesn't change, right? Um, but when we think about that within these dialectical positions, there's not only the ends, but also all that scale in the middle, and that people move in different contexts in different ways, right? So they may desire economic assimilation. That is, they may uh, be willing to devote to make themselves workers like those workers of the host country, so that they can be part of that economic situation. Linguistic integration, right, where they maybe will speak in the host language outside of the home, but maintain their home language within the home, right? And social separation, where they maybe only go to church with other people of their group, right? Producing not the melting pot society where everyone was supposed to try to become the same, but rather a salad society. I love that term, a salad society, where each group retains a distinctive flavor but blends together to make up one great society. Many people in today's world who consider themselves a product of many cultures, not easily fitting into any of the categories, are also cultural hybrids. As individuals encounter new cultural contexts, they have to adapt to some extent. There's always some form of adaptation, even if that adaptation is resistance and separation. This adaptation of process occurs in context, varies with each individual, and is circumscribed by relations of dominance and power in so-called host cultures, right? So always think about context, always thinking about how not only can we talk about people adapting as groups, but also as individuals, and how that always involves relations of dominance and power, right? So how the migrant fits in with the host culture. We think about cultural adaptation, that's that long term process of adjusting to and finally feeling comfortable in a new environment, right? It doesn't mean you've assimilated, right? You can feel comfortable and have separated, right? But it's how cultural adaptation, it actually results in you being part of that host culture, even if by being part of it, a lot of you is outside of it, right? How one adapts depends to some extent on the host environment, whether it's welcoming or hostile, right? Um, and that can have to do with how long it takes to adapt, or how easy or difficult it is to adapt, and then of course what adaptation processes work. So here's where we're going to talk about kind of the dialectical approach from each position. We'll start with the social science approach to cultural adaptation. So The social science approach focuses on the individual and the adaptation process, individual characteristics and background of the migrant, and the individual outcomes of adaptation. So, when we think about studying this, we want to see what is the actual process through which people adapt. How can we describe kind of who they were before the process, how they moved through the process, and what is the end of that process, what are those outcomes? Okay. Um, there are three models discussed here. So the anxiety and uncertainty management model, the transition model, and the integrative model. Many individual characteristics, including age, gender, preparation level, and expectations, can influence how well migrants adapt. That makes sense, right? Depending on the power structures within each host culture and their relationship to these individual characteristics, it can be much more difficult or easier to adapt. There is contradictory evidence, however, concerning the effects of age in adaptation. On the one hand, younger people may have an easier time adapting because they are less fixed in their ideas, beliefs, and identities. Because they adapt more completely, though, they may have more trouble when they return home. Um, on the other hand, older people may have more trouble adapting because they're less flexible, right? So we'll talk about what are some of these kind of keys that make people make adaptation easier or more difficult that reside within the people themselves, right? Things like age, things about flexibility. And we'll also, in this case, talk about not only when we get to the next section, not only how people experience adaptation when they go to a new culture, but also when they return to their home cultures. So, more about the social science approach. Communication, William Gutekunst stresses the primary characteristic of relationships in intercultural adaptation as ambiguity. The goal of effective intercultural communication be reached by reducing anxiety and seeking information, a process known as uncertainty reduction. There are several kinds of uncertainty. In any interaction, it is important not only to predict how someone will behave, but also to explain why the person behaves in a particular way, right? So part of understanding a culture is understanding how people are most likely to behave and being able to kind of explain, well, why does a person act this way? Well, you have to understand the culture in order to do that, right? And so there can be a lot of anxiety based on this uncertainty of not understanding cultural norms and cultural expectations. Usually people have prior knowledge about someone or they gather more information about the person, right? To reduce that uncertainty. So predictive uncertainty is that inability to predict what someone will say or do, right? So you say, go to a party and you're not sure at all what you should bring as a gift for the host. If you bring the wrong thing, it might be offensive, right? Or if you bring nothing, it might be offensive. But if you bring the perfect thing, right? Um, it can kind of build that relationship between you and the host, right? So not knowing at all kind of how to predict the outcome of that situation can cause an extreme amount of anxiety, right? Explanatory uncertainty is the inability then to explain why people behave as they do, right? So not only can I say like I brought the right gift and they're like, wow, that worked, but I have to be able to kind of understand, well, why did it work, right? And be able to explain that in a way. So migrants also may need to reduce the anxiety level that is present in intercultural context. So think about, right, going into a culture that's tremendously different than your own and trying to figure out, predict how people are going to behave and be able to kind of understand it enough to explain it, right, to make sense of it. Some level of anxiety is optimal during an interaction. Too little anxiety may convey that one doesn't care about the person, and too much causes one to focus only on the anxiety and not on the interaction, right? So a little nervousness when we meet new people it's not a bad thing, right? It's we are nervous because we're interested, right? Um, but too much, and we get focused on that anxiety. The theory is complicated, however. Some general suggestions for increasing effectiveness are useful. The theory predicts the most effective communicators, those who are best able to manage anxiety and predict and explain others' behaviors, have these kind of basic features, right? They have a solid self concept and self esteem. It is easier, right, to communicate with others if you're confident in yourself. So, part of what we do in this class is kind of become more self aware, right? Two, have flexible attitudes, a tolerance for ambiguity, and empathy. and behaviors, right? So flexible, that is, we're kind of open and willing to understand people who are different from us, right? And three, are complex and flexible in their categorization of others, their ability to identify similarities and differences and avoid stereotypes, right? So something else been working on is kind of recognizing stereotypes and trying to avoid kind of falling into those stereotypes. So these are kind of for effective communicators, some things that we can work on and develop within ourselves to make us more effective communicators. The situation in which communication occurs is important in this model. The most conducive environments are informal, with support from and equal representation from different groups. So remember, we've talked about this in previous chapters, where if we have intercultural contact between a large number of the dominant group and a small number of the minority group, um, the minority group is going to have high levels of anxiety, right? So how do we mitigate that? Well, we try to make that more even though it's not even in the society itself, to make it more even as people migrate and join the host culture. So this model requires that people are open to new information and recognize alternative ways to interpret information. The principles may operate differently according to the cultural context. And the theory predicts cultural variability. That is, different individuals in different cultures will have more or less uncertainty depending on their contexts. Culture shock and adaptation have been viewed as a normal part of human experience, as a subcategory of what we might call transition shock. All transition experiences involve change, including some loss and some gain for individuals. Cultural adaptation depends in part on the individual. Each person has a preferred way of dealing with new situations. Psychologists have found that individuals prefer either a flight or fight approach to unfamiliar situations. Notice our dialectic, flight or fight. Many migrants who prefer a flight approach when faced with a new situation tend to hang back, get the lay of the land, and see how things work before taking the plunge and joining in. A second method, the flight approach, involves jumping in and participating. A third alternative, of course, in a dialectical position, is the flex approach, in which migrants use a combination of productive fight or flight behaviors, right? In some situations, choosing to jump in, and others choosing to kind of hang back and see what's going on. A model of adaptation is developed by communication scholar Young Yun Kim. Kim suggested adaptation is a process of stress, adjustment, and growth. Right, so an initial stress or cultural shock, and adjustment to that, and through that adjustment, right, personal growth. This model fits very well with our dialectical approach and its emphasis on the interconnectedness of individual and context in the adaptation process. Adaptation occurs through communication. That is, the migrant communicates with individuals in a new environment and gradually develop new ways of thinking and behaving. In the process, the migrant achieves a new level of functioning and acquires an intercultural identity. Not everyone grows in the migrant experience, right? So this is kind of an idealized version, right? That you're going to, in the face of cultural shock, you're going to adjust and grow. But not everyone does. Some individuals have difficulty adapting in new ways and may never really adapt to their host culture. According to the cognitive dissonance theories of the 1950s, individuals typically have three options when confronting ideas or behaviors that do not fit with previously held attitudes. They can, one, reject the new ideas, two, try to fit them into their existing frameworks, or three, change their frameworks, right? So, once again, right, three very kind of different approaches. Communication may have a double edge in adaptation. Migrants who communicate frequently in their new culture adapt better, but also experience more cultural shock. This makes sense. The more you interact with a new culture, the more shock you're going to face because of these interactions, right? When feelings of helplessness and inadequacy arise during the cultural adaptation, social support from friends can play an important role in helping the newcomer reduce stress, clarify uncertainty, and increase a sense of self and self-esteem, right? So what do we know? We know that providing social support, supporting migrants as they adapt to the dominant culture works, right? So there are things we can do to help people adapt to our cultures. Much of the early research on cultural adaptation concentrated on a single dimension, right? We just change one variable. That's the way science works, right? Change one variable and kind of study everything. But more recent research emphasizes a multidimensional view of adaptation and applies best to voluntary transitions, right? So that is that it's a very complex procedure of adaptation, and therefore it's hard to kind of isolate one variable. Instead, we need to look for ways to look at it more holistically. There are at least three aspects or dimensions of adaptation: psychological health, functional fitness, and intercultural identity. Remember that intercultural identity is kind of what you achieve at the end through growth, right? So part of adapting involves feeling comfortable in new cultural context. Psychological health is the most common definition of adaptation, one that concentrates on the emotional state of the individual migrant. So this is kind of when the person has adapted enough to feel comfortable in their new context. If migrants are made to feel welcome, they will feel more comfortable faster. Achieving psychological health generally occurs more quickly than the second outcome, functional fitness, which involves being able to function in daily life in many different contexts, right? So psychological health means that you feel okay where you are. Functional fitness is also that next level. Not only you feel okay, but you actually can participate in daily activities in the new culture. Some psychologists see adaptation mainly as a process of learning new ways of living and behaving. That is, they view the acquisition of skills as more important than the psychological well being. Specifically, newcomers to a society should learn the local rules for politeness, the rules of verbal communication style, and typical use of nonverbal communication. Newcomers will become functionally fit more quickly if host members are willing to communicate and interact with them. A potential outcome of adaptation, then, is the third step: the development of an intercultural identity or intercultural personhood, right? Where the migrant sees themselves as part of, right? Also separate from, right? But as part of this host culture. So they have some kind of new identity that's not their home identity, and they may not be all the way in the host identity, but instead are intercultural identity, where you kind of understand yourself between the cultures. So think about the interpretive approach then to cultural adaptation. We want to focus on in-depth descriptions of the adaptation process. But rather than looking at kind of surveys and large number of data, we're going to look at a phenomenological approach. That is, it's interested in an individual's lived experience in the world. So this is where we're talking about like interviews and focus groups, right? Things where you're really getting nitty-gritty details from people in their lived experience. Scholars using this approach explore the essential structures of lived experience through careful and systematic analysis of interview data and participant observation. So many theories describe how people adapt to new cultural environments. The most common theory from the interpretive approach is the U curve theory of adaptation. This theory is based on research conducted by Norwegian sociologist Sverre Leisegard, who interviewed Norwegian students studying in the United States. The main idea is that migrants go through fairly predictable phases in adapting to new cultural situations. The first phase is the anticipation or excitement phase. When a migrant first enters a new cultural context, he or she may be excited to be in the new situation and only a little apprehensive. The second phase is the culture shock phase. It's a relatively short term feeling of disorientation, of discomfort due to an unfamiliarity of surroundings, and the lack of familiar cues in the environment. Individuals can experience culture shock in many intercultural experiences, overseas and domestically. For example, minority students attending mostly white universities or colleges may experience culture shock. Although most individuals experience culture shock during the period of transition to a new culture, they are less likely to experience it if they maintain separateness, because culture shock presumes cultural contact. For many individuals, long term adaptation is not easy. Some people actively resist assimilation in the short term. The third phase is adjustment, in which migrants learn the rules and customs of the new cultural context. So, although the U curve seems to represent the experience of many short term sojourners, it may be too simplistic for other types of migrants, right? For long term migrants. When migrants return home to their original cultural context, the same process of adaptation occurs, and some may again involve cultural or reentry shock depicted by a W curve model. Some of this adaptation is even more difficult because it's so unexpected. So, the W curve theory is a theory of cultural adaptation that suggests that sojourners experience another U curve upon returning home, right? So, think about students who go to study abroad and they come back home. Scholars refer to this process as the W curve theory of adaptation because sojourners seem to experience another U curve. The anticipation of returning home, cultural shock and finding it's not exactly as expected, and then gradual adaptation. Other terms for the process of readapting in one's home culture include reverse culture shock, reentry shock, and repatriation. There are two fundamental differences between first and second U curves related to issues of personal change and expectations. In the initial curve phase, the sojourner is fundamentally unchanged and is experiencing new cultural context, right? So, when you first go somewhere, you are who you have been in your home country, and then interacting with a new host country or host environment, right? In the reentry phase, the sojourner has changed through the adaptation process and has become a different individual, right? So the idea is you don't return from that intercultural experience the same person you were when you left, right? Students who return home after an overseas experience often talk about how their friends and families expect them to be a little different, like more educated, but basically the same as they were before. But they aren't, right? They've changed, they've grown in their experiences with this new culture. Returnees also need to recognize that cultural context of reentry may present new challenges of adaptation. Depending on how long the person was away, political figures, popular culture, family, technology, and even language may have changed. Sojourners who leave their countries during times of political upheaval and return when peace is reestablished may have to contend with the ambivalence many of those who stayed have towards those who left, right? So, um, not only is the individual change in leaving and then coming back, right? But the context that you're returning to may not be the same home context you left. And that's particularly true the longer you're gone, right? So, using a phenomenological approach, Chen interviewed Chinese international students and described in depth how they experienced and made sense of the adaptation process. She describes three phases: taking things for granted, making sense of new patterns, and coming to understand new information. In the first phase, migrants realize their assumptions are wrong and need to be altered, right? So, we set up this system of expectations, and almost always those expectations are going to be wrong to some degree, right? So in the second phase, migrants slowly begin to make sense of the new patterns through communication experiences, right? So how do we grow into a new culture? We have to experience it. How do we do that? Through communication, right? In the third phase, migrants begin to make sense of their experiences, interactions in new cultural contexts. They come to understand them in a more holistic way. Uh, Christ Jansdotter explored the adaptation experience of a group of undergraduate chemistry majors who worked in French chemistry labs during the summer break. Using a phenomenological approach, she interviewed the students several times before they left, during their sojourn in France, and after they returned to the States. Her findings reflect the embodied visceral experience of their cultural adaptation, specifically in struggles with language, their experience of their national and ethnic identity, and their acquired knowledge. Mass media also plays a role in helping sojourners and immigrants adapt. Radio, television, movies, and so on are powerful transmitters of cultural values and readily accessible as sources of socialization for newcomers. The mass media may play an especially important role in the beginning stages of adaptation. Right? What's one of the easiest ways for us to experience communication of another culture? Well, watch a movie or a TV show, right? Listen to music from this new culture. Finally, we have the critical approach to cultural adaptation. What we're doing here is then integrating ideas of power and power dynamics and thinking about contextual influences. So, some contexts are easier to adapt to than others, and some environments are more accepting. Young Kim writes about the receptivity of the host environment and the degree which the environment welcomes newcomers. She maintains that in a country like Japan, which emphasizes homogeneity, people may be less welcoming towards outsiders than in less homogeneous settings, as in many contexts in the United States. Local institutions like schools, religious institutions, and social service agencies can facilitate or hinder immigrants' adaptation. Today, religious organizations are working very closely with many governments to help refugees resettle in new countries. But religious institutions do not always play facilitative roles in migrant transitions, right? So it's important to recognize, right, that there are programs in all of these areas in different contexts that provide help for migrants. But those same entities can be tools of discrimination and exclusivity as well, right? The relative status and power of sojourners and host groups also influence adaptation. Sometimes the discrimination and class issues result in conflict between recent migrants and immigrants from the same country who have been in the host country for a long time. We see this, of course, in the United States, where a lot of times issues of class are central to problems perceived by the dominant culture of migrant workers. Um, okay. And how integrated they were allowed to become. So there's one idea that temporary visas for migrant workers to work particular jobs of a particular class that maybe traditional Americans choose not to do is seen as beneficial. But when those same migrant workers have opportunities to work in different areas where traditional Americans might want to work, for example, in lawn care or in being handyman or with handy women, I guess. Um, that it's like, well, now these migrant workers who have been accepted in a particular context have entered a new context in which they may not be accepted by people of particular classes with whom they are now competing, right, or perceived as competing. Um, okay, so development of multicultural identities among individual migrants depends on three issues. One is the extent to which migrants want to maintain their own identity, language, and way of life compared to how much they want to become part of the larger society, right? Issues of adaptation. The second issue that affects how migrants develop multicultural identities is the host culture and how the host culture treats them, right? How open or closed they are, welcome and accepting they are. And the third issue that affects migrants relate to their new society and involves the ownership of political power, right? So it is possible that a community is very welcoming and accepting of migrants, but still does not provide equal or fair access to the power structures of the host country or host culture. As international migration increases and more people travel back and forth among different cultures, the lines between adaptation and reentry become less clear. The experience of living on the border was described by anthropologist Victor Turner as the experience of liminality. And so, if you are a literary studies person, you've probably talked about or studied liminality in a theory class, and people who kind of live on the lines of culture. In this case, we can think about a physical border where people are constantly in between two cultures. And then we can think about this, of course, as a metaphor of the lines within our own identities, right? So, according to Turner, liminal people are threshold people. They're neither here nor there. They are betwixt and between various cultural positions, frequently likened to death, to being in the womb, right? To birth and death, right? Um, to invisibility, to bisexuality, right? All these kind of in between things where you're not one thing or the other, you are the both and. And then, of course, we think about our dialectical approach. You're both one thing and the other, and a lot of other things in between, and that you're fluid and you move between these different choices and who we are kind of constantly, right? This is liminality. Liminality is this idea of living at the limit, right? Across the limit, kind of violating borders. It's much easier if we could put things into nice, clear categories, right? Things that are liminal are those things that don't seem to easily fit into just one category. This transnationalism calls into question comforting notions like nation states, national languages, and coherent cultural communication. People who move back and forth between cultural worlds often develop a multicultural identity, right? That is, you're not one thing or the other, you're both and. Communication scholar Rada Hegde uses the metaphor of swinging on a trapeze to describe the immigrant's experience of vacillating between cultural patterns of the homeland and the new country. Right, so movement between the cultures is never as simple as just getting on a plane and going there. Right, it's always this constant kind of back and forth of the trapeze. Even if you're physically in one place, your identity is constantly swinging back and forth, and that's how you kind of navigate your adaptation and your cultural development and your relationship to both your home country and your host country, or in this case, if they're both your home countries, right? Um, which can happen a lot to people, particularly who live near or on borders, but also with the ease of international travel, people who are regularly living, right? Not just visiting, but living in two places. So, as always, if you have questions, please let me know, and I look forward to hearing from you.